Hey everyone, I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. We're excited to bring you another in our series of interviews with top leaders in health IT. And our guest today is Matt Gitelis. He's CEO and founder at PatientIQ. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, excited for the discussion. Talking about the patients, which I love. I love topics related to patients. Sometimes we get stuck in the business of medicine. But before we go there, tell us a little bit about yourself and PatientIQ.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for having me. So first, PatientIQ, we're a healthcare software company. And what we do is we specialize in the large scale collection of patient-reported outcome measures at healthcare systems of all shapes and sizes. A bit about me. I'm the founder and CEO of the company. I originally come from, I guess you'd say, is a medical family. So my father's a doctor, mother a nurse. And I have siblings who are all in medicine today. So despite the medical kind of institutional roots, I actually paved my path outside of healthcare entirely. So I have a finance background. I started my career on Wall Street as an analyst. And during those early formidable years of my professional journey is really where I learned to appreciate the power of data and how we can use data to make important high impact decisions. Um, in my, to fast forward a bit, in my mid to late 20s, I just came to this personal realization that I wanted to keep using those same skills, but in a different field, and that led me to healthcare. But it was a big pivot. I actually went to medical school, and while in medical school, I first I knew I found my home. I loved the idea of working with patients. I loved the what I was learning and the subject matter. But I'll just give the quick aha moment, and this is not my second career pivot, is when I realized there was just such an opportunity to learn more in using data for how our patients do after we treat them. The real quick story is I was working in the clinics, and I was working on a surgical team, and I remember we're tasked, kudos to healthcare providers. We had to see 60 to 70 patients on a Monday, and we're seeing our post-ops. I see a patient 3 months post-op, and I'm a fly on the wall. I'm doing nothing, let's be clear. My attending provider, we evaluate the patient. Overall, things look good, not great. Patient looks stable. We say, your x-ray looks good. So far, nothing's really making us majorly concerned, so follow up as needed. And after we walk out of the exam room, I look to my attending, I'm like, well, how do we know if, and I'll make up the name, how do we know if Jane actually got better? And the doctor kind of quickly quipped, well, she'll call us, she'll come back, something will be wrong, and moving on to the next one. To me, that was this like such a foundational moment when I was like, we really like, is it really true that we don't keep score, like tabulate what happened to Jane 1 year later, 2 years later? And it sent me down this like huge path to explore patient-reported outcomes, and which is the science in art to actually measure that data. And then I founded the company PatientIQ, which I'm excited to talk to you more about.
That's awesome. I mean, I love that you have a story behind it. I think most people have the story of how did they get to healthcare, but seeing that disconnect must have woken you up. And talk to us about, how are these patient-reported outcomes, a lot of people say PROs, different from, say, the clinical measures that are commonly collected in an EHR?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's no shortage of data that we collect in healthcare. And I think when people think of clinical measures, we're probably thinking of like physiological data, such as, measuring blood pressure or a patient's weight or BMI or lab values. We also have other data that's, pretty well documented in the EHR, such as physical examination data or range of motion, things of that nature. What really makes a patient-reported outcome measure distinctly different is how you collect the data. So first, this is data that's collected directly from the patient, and it's unfiltered. So what we do is we, as a community of healthcare researchers and scientists, we've developed what are called validated patient-reported outcomes measures. These are surveys. These surveys are all designed to measure certain things. They measure symptom, they measure quality of life, they measure pain and other things. So a patient-reported outcome measure is meant to be administered. Patient completes the survey, it's unfiltered, a score is calculated, and then we're supposed to use that score in our clinical decision-making and our research and everything else. So it's very, very different because you ask the customer directly, how are you feeling? Are you pain free? Are you able to achieve your activities of daily living? To me, the analogy I think of is instead of asking the mechanic, did he fix the car? Instead, you ask the customer, is the car fixed? And I actually think you can learn a lot. There's a lot of different signal when you ask the customer about their perspective of if the car is fixed.
That may be a little too personal since I just got the car from a mechanic, but no, I mean, you're right. It's amazing that it's an aha moment to say, patient, how are you doing? Right? Like, it's a little sad that's kind of true, right?
Yeah, and that's honestly, I agree probably more than anyone. In fact, and I think this is what, and I got into this, and patient-reported outcomes been around for a long time, but I've been in this world like all in the last 10 years, and we've come a long way as a community about using this type of data. And there's a lot of reasons why logistically, operationally, it's hard to incorporate this into busy healthcare settings, deploy it with constraints of the current technology that these hospitals have access to. But yeah, at the end of the day, this is how every industry does it. And I'll give you one other analogy. If you think about how you take an Uber, everyone's taking an Uber. Uber is the company, then you have the drivers, and then you have the customer, which is the passenger. When you get dropped off at your destination, you close the door, you thank the driver. Within 30 seconds, you're getting an assessment about how was your ride. I assure you, Uber uses that data for everything. They use it to align incentives with their drivers. They use that data to measure the performance of their drivers, to identify regions where they have to do some quality control work. To me, the power's in the underlying data and that you actually use. And so this is just one more signal. I believe that's a huge area of opportunity for modern healthcare systems.
Yeah. Well, it's obvious to see why that's useful. But why don't you think healthcare is focused more on patient-reported outcomes? Is it that it doesn't integrate with the billing? Is it like, I don't
Yeah.
know. What do you think they are the fundamental issues of why we haven't done this before, or maybe done it more, I'd say.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's first, patient-reported outcomes started in research, and that was their identity, their DNA for a long time. Where and we're at PatientIQ, we support that use case too with the launch of our Research Pro product line. But the history of patient-reported outcomes these are surveys that you use only in clinical trials, and they didn't really have much of a home in clinical care. So the question is, why don't we use them in clinical care if we believe that data is valuable? So to me, I think it's a bit of a cultural shift. And this has been happening over the course of, I think, the last few decades, where asking the patient directly about how you're feeling, did we achieve the outcome that you were looking for? This is, I believe, where healthcare is going. And actually, I would argue where healthcare is today, but it certainly is not healthcare of maybe 2 decades ago, where it was much more focused on clinical measures. But then there's the operational. So if you think about the nature of this data, a lot of healthcare, even despite the digital transformation that's still happening, in this post-COVID world, a lot of healthcare data collection is done when the patient's within the 4 walls of the hospital. Patient checks in, they go through registration, they input their billing information, they go through their encounter, doctor and MA documents in the EMR, et cetera. Those workflows, all that documentation, the data collection is done physically while the patient's in the building. The challenge with patient-reported outcomes assessments is you actually have to survey the patient. And the best way to do that is asynchronous when they're not physically in the building, because you'll just slow down your clinics, which will, this is a business at the end of the day. So I think the technology had to catch up to where we can build scalable approaches using automation algorithms to assign the right assessment to the right patient at the right time. Because there is, at the end of the day, it's a survey, but getting the right survey to the patient, you have to understand their underlying disease. You have to understand where this patient is in their care plan, whether they're pre-treatment, post-treatment, recovery, et cetera. What you measure does change. So just like everything in healthcare, it's a bit more complex, but I do think now this is on trend. This is almost all healthcare systems that we're talking with. This is either a key initiative or one that they know they need to work towards, because there's increasing, I would just say focus on measuring the patient's perspective in patient-centered care. The payers have come out, including CMS, that this is now going to become required for reimbursement. And so I do think this is going to become an integral part of modern healthcare delivery.
Yeah, I mean, I'd throw one other thing. The fact that we all carry a smartphone in our pocket has opened up the ability to respond to those things, and that the communication channels that were necessary to provide that real-time feedback is part of that evolution of, what survey to send, but also, how do you send it and how do you get the feedback? We shouldn't have to wait 6 months for Prascani scores to come out, right? Like, we can get it in near real time.
Correct. And in a Prascani, that's like a random sampling methodology. So you're not even getting all of your patients. So you can incorporate a Prascani into clinical decision making. No, you're spot on. So the best way to reach these patients are you have to meet them where they are. A lot of times we find that's text messages, that's emails, that's you have to make these multilingual. So there's barriers to reaching out to patients, as anyone who's worked in this field knows. And yeah, we had to kind of develop the tools and the playbook. And at PatientIQ, this is where we believe we're one of the vendors leading the way to give hospitals like a turnkey solution to do these types of programs, but at scale across tens and hundreds of thousands of patients across all of their care settings.
That's awesome. I mean, to your point, I think we've gone from a time when they didn't have to because they had enough patients to now where it's shifted, where they can't take them for granted. They need to listen to the patient because of the value-based care and, ACOs, et cetera. What are some examples and ways that healthcare organizations should be using PROs, in these patient-reported outcomes, and how are they able to use that to support more personalized care?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that the highest level, there's really two kind of roads you can go down, and most groups go down both. You can go down the collection and use of patient-reported outcomes for standard of care. At PatientIQ, we have a product line that's geared just for this use case. We call it Clinical Pro. Then the other path you can go down is to use patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials and research. So we have a separate product line called Research Pro. So for the Clinical Pro product line and the use cases that we see that makes this data so valuable are first and foremost using the technology to do all the logistical heavy lifting of collecting the assessments. What hospitals don't have right now are just resources laying around, more FTEs to do manual data collection. So our approach is 100% automated, not 99%, 100%. So 0 FTEs are involved in the actual acquisition of the data. So then you could focus on what I believe are all the actual fun use cases of incorporating PROMs or PRO data into clinical care. So what are those? Well, there's tremendous signal in this data, so you can use it to tailor treatment plans. So for instance, some patients are higher acuity, they need more care. Some patients need lower acuity care. How do you know if the patient's not in the hospital? Well, patient-reported outcomes can fill that void because we'll be surveying these patients while they're at home recovering, ensuring that they stay on track for a great outcome. If it's a higher acuity patient, we can meet them right then and there with targeted information, education for things that the patient can do themselves to actually ensure they have a great outcome and manage their risk. On the research setting, there's this huge opportunity to learn from large data sets of patient-reported outcomes. So a lot of the clinical trials that are being done today are first and foremost, because of technology, it's easier to enroll hundreds and thousands of patients in these trials and multi-center trials. What we're noticing at PatientIQ is studies are getting bigger because they're easier to administer. So they require less researchers hands-on, handing out paper surveys and paper case report forms to patients. We actually make all of that research administration much more streamlined as well. So what's the benefit? The benefit is the power of a 10,000 patient data set versus what even a few short years ago, we were publishing on 100 patients, maybe 200 patients. There's so much more we can learn about care patterns, which interventions are most effective, what is safer, and the feedback loop is shorter because we're enrolling so many more patients to get to statistical power. So anyways, there's a tremendous utility in this data. The hard part is usually just operationalizing it So you can get the data and the analytics in actually the hands of the decision maker. Clinical pro, that's the clinical team. Research pro, that's the researcher.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into both of those a little bit more. Like starting with the provider side, the clinician side. How do the clinicians react when you put that data in their hand with all these patient reported outcomes? And what are some of the outcomes you see from integrating this data, this information from your product into clinical practice? Because like you said, they usually go to the EHR and pull that data. I imagine there's a bit of a shock. Wait, what did the patient say?
No, you're spot on. You're spot on. So Ed, I mean, we have this great privilege where we work with more than 700 healthcare organizations, 22,000 providers, and we are collecting more than 1 million of these patient-reported outcomes assessments per month.
Wow.
So we've had many of these conversations where we're onboarding the providers and we're showing them how to use these tools and incorporate this data into their clinical practice. So first and foremost, I do think it's critical that the workflow, you have to bring the workflow to where the provider already has their workflow, so that clinical pro is actually embedded in the EHR, which is, I think, one of the things that we solve technologically through and with some of our partnerships with the EHR vendors. So that's a barrier that we had to overcome because the doctors are busy in the clinical staff. So now to actually their reaction to PROMs. So the analogy that we use for providers is PROMs they're like a sixth vital sign, or you could think of them as a lab value, where it's just going to be one more piece of information that you can use into your care decision making. And what we find is that there's so much signal in PROMs data that providers really didn't realize that, for instance, if you're undergoing specialized care for, let's say, a knee replacement, one of the biggest predictors of a patient's postoperative outcome score of a knee replacement is their preoperative mental health score.
Wow.
How do you measure mental health? Well, that's done in a patient-reported outcomes assessment. So we provide that score to the providers during their preoperative planning phase. So before the patient gets surgery, we provide them the score. We'll also color code it red, yellow, green, so they'll know if it's high risk or low risk. If it's high risk, we'll couple it with a recommendation. We call these alerts. So these patients may need more intensive care in their recovery phase in terms of follow-up schedules, et cetera. So there's a lot of signal in the data, but it's a relatively new data set. So we at PatientIQ, we're still educating ourselves, but also the market on we're finding new use cases of the data. I'll give one other real quick story on, I think, an analogy for a provider who realizes the power of patient-reported outcomes maybe for the first time. So as I think about providers, healthcare professionals, we call them professionals for a reason. They spend many, many years in professional training. They have advanced degrees, and they have really been in the pursuit of perfecting their craft for many, many years. So an analogy to me would be a professional athlete, like a baseball player who's in the major leagues. They spend many, many years going up the ranks, and then they finally make it to the big show. Well, if you think about the baseball player, imagine if the baseball player first learned their batting average for the very first time. It would be like this wealth of information where first, like, am I still going to be on the team? Am I doing well? Where am I? What's that? What does that mean? That's actually happening right now with patient-reported outcome measures, because it's a very, I would say, objective way to measure the impact of healthcare quality and services across care settings. So providers, when they first get their batting average, first it's a little bit of a shell shock, like, what do I do with this information? But then they realize they can actually incorporate the feedback into, let's say, changes to their care plan, changes to their treatment plan. And then it becomes this very fun exercise of improving care. And that's where we like to spend almost all of our time at PatientIQ, is partnering with our clinical providers on those types of activities.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it is eye-opening. Well, and probably like the batting average, if you open it and see that you're at 350 and you're like, that's terrible, but then you realize everyone else is at 250, you're like, oh, maybe it's not so bad.
Yeah.
Right? That's interesting.
And it's like the sub-analysis too. So because you can also, there's a lot that you can improve. So for instance, you might learn that I'm a 350 on, normal cases, but curveballs down in a way, like that's an area I need to do better. And
Mm,
this care is multidisciplinary. It's not just, one provider. You have to optimize it at the team and the peri-op setting, the clinical setting, the staff. So it's the key that we try to illuminate is using data that's rigorous, that's high volume, that you can use reliably to make decisions. And I think that's where it becomes so impactful.
yeah. And I'm sure the high volume's key because there's lots of outliers that doctors can use to justify why their score is worse. And they're very competitive. I mean, welcome to med school. That created it in our doctors, which we can use to our advantage sometimes. So interesting. Let's talk about the research side a little bit. You talked about leveraging patient-reported outcomes in research, but what is the role of using these pros or PROMs, as you call it, in driving research innovation and kind of improving the clinical trials as we know it?
Yeah, so Research Pro is really designed to streamline the end-to-end deployment of a clinical trial in a healthcare setting. So whether you're a sponsor, a med device company, a pharmaceutical company, you have to, at the end of the day, you have to work with providers and the patients they treat to run a study. So this Research Pro solution really is designed for the end-to-end management of an entire clinical trial. And the solution is first aims at making it very easy to incorporate patient-reported outcomes as an endpoint in a clinical trial. Many clinical trials are hesitant to use PROMs as an endpoint because it's hard to capture the data reliably with a high compliance rate. But because this is an area that we have so much expertise already due to our Clinical Pro product line, that's a big differentiator of Research Pro. Second is we've built a whole series of tools for researchers to make the day-to-day management of studies easier, which allows them to enroll more patients into the study to shorten the feedback loop for when we can actually measure when certain treatments reach their defined endpoints in the trials. So what we're excited to support in research innovation is that there's still so much we're learning about how to best treat our patients. So for instance, PatientIQ on our Research Pro product line, we support the largest, in the United States at least, the largest study on patellofemoral pain. This is a very rare condition that affects when a patient gets pain associated with their kneecap. And there's debate amongst the medical community about the best treatments. Sometimes you can treat those patients operatively. Sometimes you can treat them non-operatively. If you treat them operatively, there's a lot of different techniques you can do. So we're still learning. Research Pros is designed to accelerate how quickly we can test hypotheses, get confident analysis, rigorous analysis, and then get that data back into the clinical setting as fast as possible. A stat that was told to me by one of my mentors in medical school was what we publish in the peer-reviewed literature typically takes about 18 years before it shows up as standard of care. That feedback loop is too long. So we believe by having a clinical product that really aids providers with day-to-day decision-making and a research product line, which helps validate and test new products, new techniques and innovations, we actually can help shorten that cycle so we can get high quality and safe care into the hands of the providers faster.
What a beautiful vision. What are some of the nuances you've seen in collecting these patient-reported outcomes that maybe some people don't really appreciate because they're not in the weeds of collecting it, but really are key to doing it effectively? I mean, you highlighted one, which is sending the right survey. It's not one survey for everyone. If you're pre-op versus post-op, makes total sense, right? A subtle nuance that maybe some don't appreciate. What are some other things that maybe people don't appreciate about collecting these outcomes?
Yeah, so I mean, and that's funny. I make these jokes to my team internally. At the end of the day, we're just collecting a survey. Why is it so hard, guys? And then when my CPO wants to strangle me, as he has a huge engineering team with hundreds of thousands of lines of code just to collect the right survey at the right time. So
his response is people. People are complicated.
That's the answer, actually. People are complicated. So first, when validated patient-reported outcomes assessment in our Clinical Pro and Research Pro products, we support more than 1,000 of these assessments. So
Wow.
what you measure in one care setting, one medical specialty versus another, there are different validated assessments. So that produces some complexity. When you collect, there's a lot of best practices that we've learned in our real world experience, having deployed these programs, that there's some do's and some don'ts, but you can't Google it. There isn't really some authority that tells you this is how to do it. So a few of the nuances are, first and foremost, we believe that to do this, at least in a healthcare system setting, this needs to be 100% automated. It is still true today that a lot of healthcare organizations are collecting PROMs first, not at all, or on paper. That simply won't meet the needs of patient-centered care. So it has to be done via algorithm. And then the only way to do that is it has to integrate with the EHR, because the EHR is where the patients are being scheduled and diagnosed. And that is what has to feed the algorithm to get the proper assessment to the patient. I will just, call out, there's also many misconceptions about patient-reported outcomes. So John, we were talking about kind of the modalities of, texting, emailing. A lot of times, I get this, a lot of people assume that the most compliant patients who could really enter these surveys are going to be younger patients who are more comfortable on the smartphone. And actually, what we could confidently say at PatientIQ after collecting more than 25 million PROMs is that it's actually exactly the opposite. The most compliant patient population are patients 65 to 85 when it comes to measuring this type of data. And the least compliant is 18 to 35. So it's a bit counterintuitive. So,
Yeah.
well, how do you use that information? Well, we can change our strategies. We also have learned at PatientIQ that there is a threshold on too many questions. How do you know when you've reached it? Well, you can measure it. We know that in a new patient or a preoperative setting, which are both a highly engaged patient, if you go above 31 questions in a series without a break, without some type of reward for the patient, such as education or something that is a bit of a different context, they're going to drop off and you're going to be harmed with low compliance or engagement rates. So there are all sorts of these best practices that we've learned both in the standard of care setting and in the research setting that we've built into our products that really make this an easy button for a hospital that wants to get up and running, acquiring this type of data and kind of avoiding all of that nuance, those learnings, because it can be very expensive, as you know, healthcare IT, building these, HIPAA compliant systems that are patient facing. It's very expensive, and if you're not careful, you can actually harm the patient journey, which is the last thing we want to do. So it's, at the end of the day, it's a survey, but there's a lot that goes into it to make that data impactful, which is really what our mission is.
That's awesome. Well, Matt, I love the work that you're doing. I love that you're incorporating the voice of the patient, something that has been needed for a while, I think, and many patients have highlighted that. Social media definitely brought that out of a lot of patients, what the experience was really like. So it's great to see you're doing it in a rigorous fashion at scale for organizations. So thanks for taking the time to talk with us, to share your insights and perspectives. And thanks everyone for watching and listening. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com or search for Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcasting application. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Thanks for having me.